Canada is often seen as peaceful and safe. But in the early 1990s, a series of crimes shattered that image forever. At the center of this nightmare were two ordinary-looking people, Karla Homolka and Paul Bernardo. Paul Bernardo was born in 1964 and grew up appearing normal on the surface. He was intelligent, charming, and ambitious. But beneath that surface was a dark obsession that would later terrorize an entire country. Karla Homolka, born in 1970, came from a seemingly normal family. Friends described her as cheerful and loving. No one suspected that she would become part of one of the most disturbing crime stories in Canadian history. Their paths crossed in the late 1980s. Paul was controlling, manipulative, and violent. Karla was young, eager to please, and desperate for love. What began as a relationship slowly turned into something terrifying. Behind closed doors, Paul's violent fantasies grew stronger. Karla did not stop him. She joined him. In 1990, young women in the Toronto area began reporting sexual assaults. The attacker was called the Scarborough Rapist. Fear spread across the city. No one knew that the man responsible was living an ordinary life, dating, working, and planning something far worse. As police struggled to identify the rapist, Paul and Karla's relationship grew darker. Their crimes escalated from assault to something far more horrifying. And then, a tragedy occurred inside their own home, a crime so shocking that it would later haunt the entire nation. Canada was about to discover that monsters do not always hide in the shadows. Sometimes, they smile. The violence did not stop. It escalated. Behind closed doors, Paul Bernardo's control over Karla Homolka became absolute. He manipulated her emotions, isolated her from friends, and slowly erased her sense of right and wrong. What once felt like fear turned into obedience. In 1990, the attacks around Scarborough continued. Young women were assaulted late at night, dragged into darkness, and left traumatized. The media named the unknown attacker the Scarborough Rapist, and panic spread across Toronto. Yet Paul walked free. He went to work. He smiled at neighbors. He planned his wedding. Karla stood beside him. Then came the crime that crossed a line even they could not erase. In December 1990, Karla's younger sister Tammy died inside their family home. At first, it was called a tragic accident. But the truth was far darker. Tammy had been drugged. What happened that night was later described as unthinkable, a betrayal so horrific that it stunned even seasoned investigators when the details finally emerged. Paul and Karla attended Tammy's funeral. They cried in public. They accepted sympathy. No one suspected a thing. After Tammy's death, instead of stopping, the crimes intensified. Paul and Karla married in 1991 in a ceremony that looked joyful to outsiders. White dress. Smiling faces. Photographs filled with happiness. But behind the wedding smiles was a pact of violence. They began targeting young girls together. Victims were lured, drugged, assaulted, and recorded. Evidence was hidden. Lies were carefully maintained. For years, they believed they were untouchable. Police were still searching for the Scarborough Rapist, unaware that the answers were hiding in plain sight. Canada was living next to its worst nightmare. And the worst was still to come. By 1992, the crimes had reached their darkest stage. Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka were no longer acting on impulse. Their actions were planned, recorded, and hidden with chilling precision. They believed they were in control. But cracks were beginning to form. Paul's violent behavior escalated even further, and Karla herself became a target of his abuse. The relationship that once felt like devotion turned into fear. Bruises appeared. Hospital visits followed. Friends began to notice that something was terribly wrong. Behind the scenes, videotapes existed. Tapes that documented the assaults. Tapes that showed Karla not as a victim, but as a participant. Those tapes would later become the most disturbing evidence in Canadian legal history. In 1992, two teenage girls disappeared from the Ontario area. Their bodies were later discovered, confirming that the Scarborough Rapist was now a killer. The nation was horrified. As pressure mounted, Karla made a decision that would shock the country. She left Paul and went to the police, presenting herself as a battered wife forced into silence. She told investigators that she had been abused, controlled, and threatened. At the time, police believed her. Karla agreed to testify against Paul in exchange for a plea deal. The agreement was signed before the videotapes were discovered. Then the tapes were found. And everything changed. The images revealed a truth far worse than anyone expected. Karla was not just a victim. She was an active partner in the crimes. But it was too late. The deal had already been made. Canada watched in anger and disbelief as the full horror of the case was revealed, and as justice began to feel painfully incomplete. The courtroom became a battlefield of emotions. When the trial began, Canadians expected justice. What they witnessed instead was outrage, disbelief, and heartbreak. Paul Bernardo was finally exposed as the Scarborough Rapist and a serial killer. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The videotapes, witness testimonies, and forensic proof painted a picture of calculated evil. He showed no remorse. In 1995, Paul Bernardo was convicted and sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. For many, this was the only moment of relief in a case filled with darkness. But the real shock came with Karla Homolka. As details of the videotapes became public, Canadians realized the truth too late. Karla had not been a helpless victim. She had participated willingly. She had planned. She had assisted. And yet, because of the plea deal signed before the tapes were found, Karla received a dramatically reduced sentence. She was sentenced to just 12 years in prison. The country erupted in anger. Protests filled the streets. Newspapers called it a failure of justice. Victims' families felt betrayed. The media labeled Karla Homolka the deal with the devil. People asked one question again and again. How could someone involved in such crimes ever walk free? The case forced Canada to confront uncomfortable truths about the justice system, about how deals are made, how evidence is handled, and how easily monsters can manipulate the law. As Karla served her sentence quietly, public rage never faded. And everyone knew what was coming next. The most controversial moment of all. Her release. 2005, Karla Homolka was released from prison. After serving her full 12-year sentence, she walked out a free woman. Canada reacted with fear and outrage. Parents were warned. Schools were alerted. Communities protested. Many believed that someone involved in such horrific crimes should never be allowed back into society. Karla changed her name. She moved repeatedly. She tried to disappear. But the past refused to let her go. Wherever she went, her identity followed. Media tracked her movements. Public anger resurfaced. For the families of the victims, her freedom felt like a second betrayal. Paul Bernardo, on the other hand, remains behind bars. Labeled one of Canada's most dangerous serial killers, he continues to serve a life sentence. His parole requests have been consistently denied, and he is expected to die in prison. The case left scars on the nation. It exposed failures in the justice system. It showed how manipulation can overpower truth. It forced Canada to rethink how plea deals are made. Most importantly, it reminded the world that evil does not always look terrifying. Sometimes, it looks normal. Sometimes, it smiles. Sometimes, it stands right beside you. The story of Karla Homolka and Paul Bernardo is not just about crime. It is about trust. It is about justice. And it is about the cost of believing the wrong person. A story Canada will